I wanted to talk tonight about the subject of anti-Semitism. Um, and let me start with relatively recent events. Um, After the nature of the October the 7th attacks became clear, I said that there are some times in your life when a flare goes up and you can see everybody exactly where they are. Everyone is caught exactly where they're standing. I thought that in part because I was in New York on the 7th, and the next day, the 8th, there was a protest immediately planned in Times Square. It wasn't a protest in support of the Israelis who had already been massacred. It wasn't even a protest against, I don't know, war. It was a protest in favor of the ongoing massacres, where people were waving banners, celebrating atrocities which were still going on. And I thought then, well, I have to go to Israel as soon as I can in order to see this for myself, because it was my belief then, as it is now, that not only was this a moment when you would see everyone where they were, but that several things would happen. One was what I described as Holocaust denial in real time, where even as the atrocities were still going on, and people were saying they hadn't happened, or that the Israelis had carried them out. There was a huge debate in the early weeks about whether or not the Israelis should release the footage that Hamas filmed themselves. And by the way, you've got to have a particularly perverted mind to believe that the Israelis made Hamas take the GoPro footage of the thing. The striking thing about all of the footage from the 7th, from the Hamas terrorists, is that they were wildly proud of their achievements. Wildly proud. And also wildly gleeful, which is a sort of new level of evil in a way. Many people have done many evil things in history, but very few are actively proud of them in this way. Some of you may have heard the intercepted conversation of one of the terrorists calling his mother in Gaza and saying, I'm calling you on a Jew's phone. I've killed 10 Jews with my own hands. Pass father onto the phone. Pass all the family on. I want to tell them all. Your son has killed all these people with his own hands. When I arrived in Israel and started to speak not just to the survivors, spend time with the families of the hostages, but also go around the sites of all the massacres in the communities in the south, villages, kibbutz of Be'eri and near Oz, and the site of the festival, the dance festival, where all these hundreds of beautiful young people were just dancing in the early morning when true evil arrived in their midst. When I went around this, I always had a disconnect because as I heard all these stories firsthand and was shown the footage of people's own footage of the day, partygoers who had recorded a little bit of their escape or their friend's death, all the time I looked back home to New York, to London, to Europe, and everywhere sympathy had gone the other way. And I thought that was extraordinary. I sort of expected it all my life. Whenever Israel has done anything, world response goes up and up and up, whatever the size of the Israeli action. I first heard the accusation the Israelis were committing genocide in Gaza in 2008, so I'm a little jaded with that accusation. It would also, of course, make it the only genocide in history in which the population doubled, but let's put that aside for a second. It struck me that all these people back home didn't for a day call for the release of the Israeli hostages. Not one day. I'd have some sympathy and understanding and indeed respect for people who said, I campaigned for the release of the hostages. I paid my respects to the dead and the murdered of the 7th, and I deeply sympathized with their families, but I also sympathized with the innocent Palestinians. I'd have some respect for that position. But it's very hard to have any respect for somebody's allegedly anti-war position when they're mute at the largest murder of Jews since the Holocaust. A friend of mine came through Tel Aviv in January, and he said, Douglas, this is the first place I've been since October when none of the hostage posters have been torn down. I thought, think about that for a moment, that in London, you can't put up a hostage poster, even if a now 18-month-old child, without it being torn down. One of the relatives of the Bibas child, who's the youngest hostage, who passed his first birthday in captivity. One of his relatives told me he went to Dublin to try to appeal to the Irish Taoiseach for his help, some help. And he actually saw there the poster of his baby relative being ripped. I said, just think about that for a second. If here in Rotterdam somebody put up a poster to their missing dog, would anyone pull it down? Would anyone rip it down? If they did rip it down, would we not all say, who is this sick person going around ripping down posters of a missing dog? Everyone wants the dog home. And yet, that is not extended to the Jewish children, the women, or indeed the men. One of the things that's striking in Israel since the 7th is the fact that so many people are focused on the women and children and the importance of releasing them, and that is important. But there is also no crime in being a young man of 21 at a dance party. And there's no crime in being a 70-year-old grandfather who hopes to spend Simchat Torah with his grandchildren. But all the time, the sympathy went the other way. The protests on the campuses not only fell straight into the Palestinian side, but fell straight into the Hamas side. At Columbia University, there's been an encampment now for some months in the main square. Overlooking that square, by the way, 18 great figures of the Western past, including Aristotle, Plato, and Dante. I do sometimes wonder what they would think of the current state of American thought if they could see the students one of whom complained recently that there weren't adequate toilet facilities at the encampment, complained that she had to do her business in a bag and then throw it in a larger bag of shit. $65,000 a year. $65,000 a year that girl's parents pay for her education. But it's at Columbia University in New York where Jewish students have been pursued across campus by people shouting, "Go back to Poland." Or on one occasion, had a poster held up in front of them saying, "Hamas, these are your next targets." It's in London that we've had protests every single weekend. It's here in the Netherlands where you saw an 8-fold increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the month after October the 7th. And it does bear dwelling on for a second that I wonder if it was any other group in society who had suffered such a barbaric outburst, if the public would so strongly turn on the victims. It's hard to imagine. There was a maniac in America a few years ago, a white supremacist who went into a church in the South, a black church, and gunned down these innocent Christian worshippers. And nobody in the United States of America or anywhere around the world said, well, it's possible he was provoked into it. No, everyone's sympathy is with these poor families who've had to go through this horrific incident. And it's the same with any other group in society, except with the Jews. It's even I think, to the shame of this country when a Holocaust museum is opened in Amsterdam and a Holocaust survivor is photographed rushing past an angry mob screaming at him and his grandson. And one of the ways I submit that you can tell that somebody hasn't thought about anti-Semitism at all is if they say something like the following: anti-Semitism must be eradicated once and for all. The former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, occasionally used to say this. He is an anti-Semite. But he used to occasionally say, that's why anti-Semitism, racism, and all other forms of hate must be eradicated once and for all. And I used to say, that shows you've never thought about the matter. I'd submit that one of the striking things about anti-Semitism is that it seems, very sadly, to be a human perennial. And I say that because all the evidence points that way. It's also a shapeshifter. It's probably the greatest shapeshifter in history. There are people who used to hate the Jews because of their religion. And then at some point it became less acceptable to hate people because of their religion. And then the Jews were hated because of their race. And then at some point in the 20th century, it became not so good to hate people because of their race. But there was one twist left, which was that the Jews who were hated by anti-Semites because they were stateless were suddenly hated because they had a state. It's one of the insights of a number of writers that the Jews get hated for absolutely every reason. It's an unbelievable fact. The Jews have been hated historically and by people in the world today, and even on people on X today, for all of the following reasons. They have been hated because they've been poor, and they've been hated because they've been rich. They've been hated because they have not integrated into society, and they get hated for integrating into the society. They get hated for, as I say, being rootless cosmopolitans, and then for being Zionists who dare to have a state and not be rootless. Vasily Grossman, one of my heroes, the great Russian 20th century writer and journalist, took time out in the middle of his masterpiece, Life and Fate, to write about this question. And to my mind, Vasily Grossman said almost everything that can be said about anti-Semitism. Grossman, who was Jewish himself, covered the Battle of Stalingrad. He was the first journalist into Treblinka. And he knew an awful lot about human evil. And in the middle of Life and Fate, which gravitates around that midnight of the 20th century, halfway through this 900-page novel, halfway through at the midnight of the midnight, Grossman takes 3 pages to write about anti-Semitism. And he says something which can't be said often enough, and I wish more people knew. He talks about the way, he says, in which it's something you can meet everywhere. He says, you can meet it in the Academy of Sciences and in the games that children play in the schoolyard. He says, it takes many forms from a mocking, contemptuous ill will to murderous pogroms. Then he says this: anti-Semitism is always a means rather than an end. It is a measure of the contradictions yet to be resolved. It is a mirror for the failings of individuals, social structures, and state systems. Tell me what you accuse the Jews of, and I'll tell you what you're guilty of. I spoke to a psychiatrist some years ago in a professional capacity, I should stress, who claimed to me that he could tell with very considerable certainty when one of his patients was going to turn anti-Semitic. And I said, what are the giveaways? He said, one of the giveaways is it arrives just after intense paranoia. Seemed to me to make amazing sense there. Because why else do people fall into it? Why do they fall into it even if they meant not to? There's a magnificent story that Paul Berman writes about in his book called Power and the Idealists, which has the rather off-putting subtitle, Or the Strange Passion of Joschka Fischer. Not everyone wants to know about the passions of Joschka Fischer, but it's a magnificent work of intellectual history. And it gravitates around the history of the Green Left movement in Germany after the war. And as Berman says, the Germans growing up after the horrors of the Nazis they were sensible. They had one rule above all: don't be Nazis, don't be like our parents. And if you're going to have any guiding principle, that's not a bad one. But Berman shows how this generation, some of whom were flatmates of the future German foreign minister, in the 1950s were still holding to this light. Don't be Nazis, don't do what our parents did. By the 1960s, many of them have gravitated to the cause of the PLO and the nascent Palestinian movement. By the time that the Palestinians are hijacking airline planes, one of Joschka Fischer's former flatmates is on the plane with the terrorists and divides up the Jews from the non-Jews. We've done it again. I'd submit that many of the people in our own time are actually repeating that very mistake. I think that the people who have been most vocal in the last 7 months or so fall into two categories. They are what I describe as the sinister and the silly. The sinister are the ones who know exactly what they mean. When they say from the river to the sea, they know that they mean the eradication of the only Jewish state. They have a plan. They seem to approve of violence. They seem very often to be very sympathetic with Hamas, whilst knowing full well what Hamas does. And then there's the silly. Those are the ones who are very impressionable and along for the ride. I'm thinking of the sort of people who shout from the river to the sea endlessly, as if you shout something often enough, we'll agree, and couldn't identify which river they're talking about and have no idea what the sea is. There was a woman in New York who was captured on camera shouting, from the mountain to the sea. Which mountain? I don't know, the Alps, something. Look at the way in which the world has reacted in recent weeks. In the last few days, trending on X, we have all eyes on Rafah. All eyes on Rafah. Why would you have all your eyes on Rafah? Always, of course, said as if the person in question has often thought about Rafah in the past and is an expert on the whole arrangements in the neighborhood. Of course, many of these people are the people who are experts on everything and have been expert on absolutely everything in recent years. They tended to be experts on pandemics first, then they were experts on vaccine policy, then they were experts on how to withdraw from Afghanistan, they were experts on Ukraine, and now they're experts on Rafah. It's amazing how much expertise there is among idiot people. But it's very striking to me because you can actually tell an awful lot by what somebody focuses on obsessively. And if you've decided that Gaza and Israel's reaction to the 7th and the attempt to get back the hostages and the attempt to punish by killing or capturing the leaders of Hamas is somehow the thing that is going to most energize you, again, I could have some sympathy if those people had ever expressed any concern about the much greater, infinitely greater humanitarian catastrophes which are going on as I speak. I see no people screaming outside the Kinchet Gabal because of the ongoing genocide in Sudan. By the way, there are almost no cameras in Sudan. I know one journalist who's trying to get there. I would have more sympathy with these protesters and others if they had spent the last decade or more marching and hollering and shouting and screaming and claiming that they're going to do a hunger strikes which tend to last about 12 hours. And if they had done any of that for the 600,000 people or more killed in the last decade in the Syrian civil war, but not a peep, not a peep. Not a peep from those people for the 300,000 people killed in Yemen in recent years. Not a demonstration, not a riot, not a placard. Some of the protesters have learned recently about the Houthis. I'm not sure if they know the difference. They seem to think they're the same thing as the Hutus, but let's put that aside for a moment. The Houthis had no sooner cropped up on the international stage, firing at ships in the Red Sea and hitting a British vessel. No sooner had the protesters discovered the Houthis than they were hot for them as well. They had people in London chanting the next weekend, Yemen, Yemen, make us proud, turn another ship around. Imagine just finding out about a terrorist movement and knowing, yep, those are my guys. They're the guys for me. And by the way, none of those people seem to object to the fact that 13 young men who were accused of being gay in Yemen last month were sentenced to death, including by crucifixion. Extraordinary thought that, again, an extraordinary place you can come to where you decide, I'm for anyone so long as they're against us. I'm for anyone as long as they're against the values that my society holds dear. I'm for anyone so long as they're against, and I would say that you can insert at that point the word, the Jews. You know, the extraordinary thing in Israel in recent months has been that sometimes not only a flare goes up, but sometimes a crack happens in the universe. You suddenly get a very, very clear glimpse into true human evil. And we in the West have been very, very lucky in our lifetimes to very rarely glimpse that. And when we have glimpsed it, occasionally, in this country, in Paris, Manchester, and elsewhere, we tend to brush it aside or push it past us and hope we don't see it again. But in Israel on the 7th, something shattered over the whole of the society. It didn't matter whether the people in the south of Israel were Orthodox Jews or Ashkenazi or Sephardi or secular or Reform. It didn't matter what color their skin was, that they were the targets because they were Jews. And I can tell you that the clarification that this has caused in Israeli society is very, very little understood outside Israel. I was in one of the kibbutz, Be'eri, where a man who I spoke to in the hospital had been in his safe room, which some of you will know. All of the communities there had safe rooms in their houses, but they didn't lock. They were safe rooms to expect rocket fire, which happened all the time. They became far too used to. But they didn't lock because nobody expected gunmen to come house to house. All of the houses in Be'eri and near Oz and so on, the ones that are not burnt down, you go to the safe rooms and there are bullet marks around the handle, because in every one, the person on the other side was trying to hold the handle down. And some people held out for a while, some didn't. I spoke to one man who lost both his grandsons. They called him and said, we're in the safe room on our own, what do we do? And he told them to tie a rope around the handle and try to hold it down, but they were 13 and 14 and they didn't last very long against the grown-ups of Hamas. Another man I spoke to was in his safe room with his family, and he did manage to keep the door shut. And then he discovered that the terrorists had set light to the house. So they were in the unenviable position a lot of families were in on the day of either burning to death in their homes or having to flee and being machine gunned. They watched neighbors having that done to them. He realized that the house was burning down. He ended up opening the air vent in the safe room. And he was there with his son and his daughter and his wife. And the terrorists threw a grenade in and killed his wife. And then a gun came through and shot his son in both sides of his chest. And he bled out in front of his sister and father. And his father, who lost his legs in this, I spoke to in the hospital, and he said, "You know, Douglas, I was a leftist all my life." Now, this isn't to make a political point, but it's to say many of these people in the communities that were most affected were people who did everything they could in their lives to live in peace with their Palestinian neighbors. They had people who drove Palestinian children to Israeli hospitals to get treatment. There was one woman of 74 who did that every single week, and she was killed and burnt in her home by Hamas. There were people who employed Palestinian workers from Gaza because they desperately dreamed of the day when they could live in peace with their Palestinian neighbors, only to find that when the terrorists came to their communities, these people they thought were their friends in many cases had given to Hamas the complete maps of where to go and when in the communities. About 20 kilometers from the Gaza border, there's a town called Ofakim. Became quite famous because of a woman called Raquel, who is a rather remarkable woman in her 70s. And the Hamas came to her house and sought sanctuary, and she fed them and talked to them in Arabic and sort of treated them like a Jewish mother, and sort of very strange. And sometime at the very end of the day, she managed to get out of her house, and there was a massive firefight. And she walked out into the street and met a policeman who said, "We know there are 14 terrorists who come into our community, but we've only found 13. She said, "Oh, yes, there's one in my cupboard." But in Ofakim, one of the survivors showed me, who was a member of the Knesset, a member of parliament, showed me the map of one of the terrorists got from the body. And it showed his house on the map. People his community have been employing in order to live in peace, given the intelligence to Hamas. And on the map, because they knew it was a holy day, they had the first target was his house, and then the next targets were the kindergartens and the synagogues. It really does take something to regard the people who dreamed these dreams of peace as the victimizers and Hamas as somehow the victims. But yet that seems to be where much of the world has landed. It's decided, among other things, because the only acceptable form of anti-Semitism today is anti-Zionism. Some people occasionally forget to say anti-Zionism and say Jews, but many people have kept disciplined on this one. Many people seem to claim that Israel, in response to a massacre like the 7th, should either do nothing or should act on the advice of a few online Twitter warriors. It's a very curious thing, this. I've been to Gaza quite a lot in recent months, and if you see the IDF in action, it's a form of discipline in army I've never seen in any other war. They know, every single young man and woman in Gaza knows their terms of operation, and much of this is house-to-house fighting of an unbelievably difficult kind. 1 in every 2 houses in Gaza as a whole has arms dumps of some kind. Some months ago, I spoke to a commander in the Gaza whose job it was to try to locate tunnel entrances as well as arms dumps. And he said, we now no longer, if we enter a house, we now no longer look for the tunnels or the munitions in any other room other than the children's room. So we go straight to the children's room. You turn over the cot and you'll find a rocket-propelled grenade or a tunnel entrance. And many of these tunnel entrances are booby-trapped. And Israel has lost a lot of young soldiers, precisely those circumstances. It's lost soldiers because very often, as any soldier will tell you, a group of civilians come out with their hands raised, and then from the middle of the civilians come a few Hamas gunmen. A few days ago, the whole world was obsessed with what they reported on the news as being an Israeli bombing of a refugee camp. Most of the news that reported that did not report that instead of the Israelis being wildly keen on just bombing refugee camps, and like, why would they want to do that? The attack in question came because Hamas, in their infinite care for civilian Palestinian human life, launched a set of rockets at Tel Aviv from between the tents that Palestinians were in. And the Israelis struck the launch site, and it turned out that Hamas was using it also as a munitions dump. So there's a secondary explosion. But if you look at much of the world press, and from what I can see, even the Dutch press, they only report that first thing. They only say the Israelis have struck a refugee camp. It was the same at the beginning of the war. I was by the Shifa hospital when that was the focus of the world's attention. It took Israel months to identify just how many people were murdered on the 7th. But amazingly, Hamas can come up with round figures very swiftly. And there was an explosion near the Shifa hospital, which is actually not a hospital, it's more of an arms control dump and also an interrogation system. And there was a bomb there, and all the world's press said, within minutes, Israel bombs the Shifa hospital. And again, said, well, what monsters would do this? What monsters would attack a hospital? First of all, of course, as I say, it's not a hospital, it's a command headquarters, but it took days and weeks, even the press who had reported that first incident, to say, actually, it was a rocket fired by Islamic Jihad in the Gaza, which, like quite a lot of their rockets, fell short and landed in the car park. But Hamas immediately said at the time, 500 people have been killed. And the world reported this number. Not only was the story false, the numbers false, the whole thing was a crock. But as Mark Twain famously said, sometimes a lie can get all the way around the world before the truth can even get its boots on. One of the reasons I think, by the way, we should mind about this is because if Israel is not allowed to fight a war of self-defense in order to recapture its stolen civilians, then down the road, neither will a country like this one or a country like mine. If it's deemed unacceptable to want to reclaim your citizens and want to punish people who wish to destroy you, then we are all going to be in a great deal of trouble next. If you do the math, the equivalent of the 7th would be somewhere in the region of 3,000 Dutch civilians being killed in one day, and some 700 stolen into captivity. I think very highly of this country, but I would like to think that if that happened here, your country and your government would not sit back with equanimity and simply allow that not to be responded to. And if there were an organization or an entity anywhere in the world so mad as to want the destruction and murder of the entire population of this country, I would expect you to have not just the world's sympathy, but the world's support if you decided that that was something you could not live with. And that's why I think that the ability of Israel to fight wars is also the ability of our own to fight wars. But that's not the only reason, of course, to be concerned about this subject which we're gathered here today to discuss, and I'm looking forward to questions in a second. Perhaps above all else, the reason why anti-Semitism is an issue that needs to be discussed and thought about is because, of course, as all historians know, it is the most reliable precursor, the most reliable guide. If anti-Semitism flares up in a society and is tolerated, and Jews can't go safely down the streets of cities like this one, it is the sign that the society is in decay and that everybody else will be next. Curse of the Jewish people is to be the canary in this coal mine. But the world's desire to shoot the canary seems to me to be perverse, at any rate. There's a lot to unpack.
Thanks for watching. Drop a comment below. Don't forget to like, share, and hit subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Until next time, stay informed and inspired. This is Djobnik signing off.